戦弾行くわよ。泣いたところで許してあげない。トリリオンドライブ。たわしの極意。
So we're finally off to the Strahtan continent, us having to go by boat from the Lant port that, as said, has been under Strahtan control for a long time. Yeah, how did Aston not pay attention to that? The port was his responsibility as well, and yet because he ignored it, it's how the Strahtan forces even got their foothold in the country to begin with. Like, was he that focused on Fendel? Our goal is to reach the capital of Yu Liberte, but unfortunately the Windor Strahtan port is the farthest from the capital. And it's not like we could freely use either port in the country to get to our destination, as that would be silly. Instead, we have to cross the entire freaking desert. You know, I don't usually mind when games do this, have us take the long way around, then give us the fast travel option down the line. But when ship travel is the fast travel option, and we're deliberately sent to the port farthest from your destination, that gets annoying. Well, okay, I tell a bit of a lie there, as there is another ground-based fast travel system, which revolves around the traveling merchants, the Turtles, who ride around on giant turtles. They're stationed in almost every major city and can get you back quickly to towns you visited on any given continent. I kind of forget to use them several times in the game, as it's not like the monsters can actually touch me at this point. And really, we're sent this way to have us get a first-hand experience with the game's main superboss, the Rock-Ga-Gong, a giant rock monster that lives in the sands of the desert.
Who shall we have word sign the likes of which even God has never seen?
Really, it's to pad our levels, do some more side quests, and try to give a bit more flavor to the world. Which, I'm not against, it's just my annoyance thus far with the storytelling that leaves me more cold to it. Though admittedly I do get some more enjoyment out of Pascal shenanigans, including ones that involve cactus juice.
Drink cactus juice. It'll quench you. Nothing's quenchier. It's the quenchiest!
And another where we encounter a guy who thinks Pascal is in fact a weird creature, and the Martians are inhumans because Pascal, in her zealotry to get into the Wallbridge ruins, had swum around a lot in Windor's Central Lake. And in her disappearing acts in and out of the ruins, made it seem like she was the Windor Loch Ness Monster or something. Then there's Sable Izol. And man, if I was actually forced to walk these bridges myself, I would freak the hell out due to my ridiculously extreme fear of heights. And I have moments of full-body paralysis fear reactions with just sturdy bridges, not these rope ones here. But in this city, the game introduces you to Magic Carta. And while this is likely an easy game for any big fan of the Tales franchise, I am probably the worst possible player to have anything to do with it. See, unlike game-within-a-game card games like, say, Final Fantasy's Triple Triad, fun fact, while I dislike Final Fantasy VIII, I actually had a fun time playing Triple Triad in Final Fantasy XIV. I'm not good at it, but I don't find the 14 version insufferable. Well, Magic Carta is actually a trivia game, with each card of it having random trivia about previous Tales games and characters. And obviously, as I've only played a grand total of 2 Tales games to completion, there is no plausible way I would be able to know any of this. I'd have to constantly be cross-checking a guidebook for the answers, and as this game has you play against the opponent to determine which card is relevant, I would of course always lose at the matches. For people who know this stuff, it's fine. I've got nothing against the superfan Easter egg stuff. I'm just glad that the Magic Carta stuff wasn't in any way tied to progression. Otherwise, I'd be a lot more grumpy about it for instituting an unreasonably high barrier of entry, as Graces was the unlucky 13th game in the franchise, and the last of 10 games that had been released over a 7-year span of time. Yeah, 10 games in 7 years, not counting spin-offs and sidequels. Graces flopping and then causing the production staff to take a step back and spend more time making the next game, Xillia, I kind of feel was a good thing. We get more info on the Rock-Ga-Gong while we're here as well, the Strahta military beginning to perform movements against it with the citizens up in arms against them, as the Rock-Ga-Gong has never hurt a fly. For Gamera is friend to all children. He would never eat them. Deliberately. In reality, something is up with the creature that's making it act strangely. and inevitably we're the wandering adventurers tasked with dealing with such. And this is where Asbel is shown to be in his element. Two sides are fighting over a third thing, and Asbel decides to step in to see if he and his group can resolve it to people's satisfaction. If something is upsetting the creature, then fixing its problem makes the rest of the issues go away. This is his wheelhouse. And it's not his fault his previous attempts at problem resolution were being screwed over by Fendel's desperation, Hubert being a stubborn asshole, Richard being possessed by malicious spirit, and everything his father fucked up. Before heading out, you can get Pascal's second summon by visiting inside the city's central library / research installation. But once we move on to the next section of the deserts, well... Okay, we are not going out the back door.
いやー、いくらなんでもここまで大きいとは思ってなかったよ。パスカル、ずいぶん楽しそうね。
Fortunately, the Rock-Ga-Gong's stomach contains enough just plain landmass it's eaten that we can traverse back up its body without having to worry that much about stomach acid. Though the fact it's eaten entire huts whole is a bit more concerning. Though for the first time in the game, I'm with Cheria in wanting to have no interest in leaving via the rear exit. Inside the hut in the Rock-Ga-Gong's stomach, we find that this hut once belonged to a researcher and caretaker of the beast, whose papers reveal that the Rock-Ga-Gong is infrequently infested with parasites. So it acting out is a cry for help and for someone to come near it, be swallowed, and kill the parasites before it will then allow the adventurers it swallowed to leave. Plus, we found a flute that'll allow us to summon it later when we're ready for the super boss fight. Obviously, since the Eleth released through the Valkynes corresponds to 3 of the natural element quartet, the Rock-Ga-Gong is the Earth representative of the 4. So, yeah, we have to hunt through the stomach map to find all the parasites and their eggs we can, before confronting the queen of them to exterminate their entire nest. Once we're out of the game's Genbumon, it's a straight shoot to Yu Liberte, which is basically Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. Its prosperity maintained by how much water eleth they draw from their Valkynes, maintaining the city-wide oasis that allowed the city to spring up and out here. Yeah, remember what I said earlier about Strahta's motivations for taking Lant? The fact that their Valkynes is failing them? Well, it's not from them overdrawing from it. Their mechanics for doing so are actually really efficient, the most efficient of any of the 3 nations. It's just the Valkynes is releasing less and less eleth every year, and they're nearing the same crisis point Fendel spent the last 20 years in. And while one can huddle up or put on more layers to protect from the cold, well, water is an essential fundamental requirement for life. So if their Valkynes goes, the entire country is screwed. Ergo, the need for wind eleth crystals to provide additional means of moisture condensation that would make them less dependent on water eleth crystals to not further overtax their primary resource. Granted, that isn't as seen in the main city. Water is wastefully everywhere. It even run through eleth-powered springs as a decorative piece that has to be using more water eleth than they can afford to spare, or the collection of it is just in excess to need. Or it's the low-key condemnation of toxic capitalism where they waste resources left and right on needless commodities to the point they have to invade other nations to maintain their rate of unnecessary consumption. Not like that would be acknowledged internally. So yeah, we meet pretty easily with the president of Strahta, Dylan Paradine, who we actually met earlier amidst the Rock-Ga-Gong crisis, as he was one of those standing with the protesters against military actions toward the creature, and was seeking to find a solution that would preserve it so it couldn't act in the form of his political office for an issue he stood for as a civilian, as there are different duties inside the office than outside it. It's a shame so many politicians do not understand this and just use the position meant to represent the people for their own personal gain, with the worst ones tricking the people they are supposed to serve into supporting self-destructive agendas and deregulation of industries and agencies that have shown they need the oversight. So yeah, Asbel volunteering to fix the issue did him an absolute solid, and garnered from Dylan major respect points. So Dylan is happy to hear him out on his request for Hubert to stay where he is for the time being.
私のもとにはオズウェル総督は総督としての資質に欠けるものだと報告が入っているが
And he's really not, since nearly every action he's performed has been out of sheer spite, not out of the well-being of the people, regardless of how good he is at administrative duties. But as it turns out, Dylan was trying to figure out the entire mess with Lant in the first place, thus wanted Hubert back to respond in person, as Hubert's adoptive father, Garrett, has been falsifying his reports to the president to paint a very different picture of everything. Because since Hubert's already done the job in claiming Lant's territory, Garrett no longer has any use for Hubert. Thus why Garrett intended to have his nephew, who as you'll remember took Cherry hostage last time, take over for Hubert, as his nephew is someone who he can use far easier as a family member than an orphan child Garrett was going to completely disown and abandon after this. And again, this is Austin, not Asbel's fault, as this is apparently the cultured nobleman that Austin decided was the right type of man for Austin to sell his second son to. This isn't an abnormality where Austin was deceived by Garrett. This is consistent with everything we have seen with how immensely incompetent Austin was at everything due to his bullheaded hypocritical belief that he was right in everything. And thus he didn't see what was wrong with Garrett because he didn't want to see it. Like, at every turn in this game, you find that Austin enabled the treachery of the worst people on the planet while disenfranchising the innocent. Fortunately, Dylan isn't an idiot and expected Garrett's treachery at this point after dealing with him for years, having multiple sources of information, and with Hubert's report having confirmed Garrett has actually been countermanding Dylan's orders, which were to just supply Strahta with a consistent supply of wind eleth, regardless of means, and attempted to destabilize the region further to create a power vacuum Garrett would benefit from to take over the region and control its wind eleth crystal supply independently of any nation.
しかもそれを私に隠れてやろうというのはあまりにも私をないがしろにしていないかねいや、ないがしろどころではないこれは国家反逆罪にも等しい重大な問題行為だぞ
The game supports literally everything I've said, yet refuses to connect the dots back to the single person who enabled all of them. And Dylan promptly then removes Garrett from power with this evidence presented before him as more than justification for this case. All because Asbel sought to fix a problem instead of ignoring it. Asbel Lant, the great problem solver, everyone, mending everything his father broke. But the next issue is just the worldwide eleth shortage. For again, the only reason Strahta are in Windor is because they're beginning to suffer from a lack of it. And since Asbel has Pascal on his side, they can investigate why their Valkynes isn't working correctly. Dylan giving him that time and trust to look into it thanks to his prior actions, giving permission for us to approach it, which serves as our next destination. As Pascal points out while they're still in the office, that even with Strahta's rate of eleth consumption as it is now, the water Valkynes should still be producing more than enough to serve their needs. Yet as we investigate more in the city, we learn they're experiencing climate change effects as the city is slowly being reclaimed by the desert. It's just most of the citizens are a combination of too stupid and too arrogant to believe there is a changing climate problem in the first place. And those who are aware of it are being promptly ignored. But no, that wouldn't happen in real life. There'd be scientists or evidence of it locally that such a dramatic problem exists. Yeah, people are idiots. Worse, researchers Dylan had sent to look into the Valkynes have had their reports sabotaged to make him think the invasion was even necessary at all by the conservative political faction Garrett is part of. But from the report we managed to recover from a scientist after saving him, Pascal has all the info she needs to be able to propose a fix for it, which in turn has Dylan grant us permission to approach it. the artifact being hidden among Martian ruins to the west of the city, which requires yet another long commute through the deserts. And the ruins themselves don't make matters much better, as in the Strahtan military's insistence to guard the place, all the Martian safeguards for the region have been left enabled. So we have more environmental puzzles to solve. These ones being a bunch of Tetris board bridges that will raise or lower depending on which section you step on in each order. I actually like these ones, as it's more fun to just test which panels trigger what, instead of having long courses to figure out the right order to travel across, as was more the problem with the wall bridge ruins in Windor. For each of these, everything you need is right in front of you, as opposed to the path to travel being macroscopically separated. When we get to the Valkynes, though, Pascal manages to fix it with two quick things. I'm not even kidding. It is actually really painful to hold a hammer right now with how fucked up my hand is. Ow.
見るからに壊れてるところがあるから、ここが変に干渉してるんじゃないかな。だったらこれをぐるぐるってやって最後にガッとね。
And yeah, that completely brings it back to full productive capability. Pascal is a genius, and the best girl of this game, I swear. But unfortunately, this is where the other side of the plot makes its return, and the Lambda-possessed Richard returns to our attention, with him riding in on mutated flying monsters which attack us and distract us from fighting him until after he's achieved his goal, completely draining the Valkynes Crius of its water eleth. Well, okay, not permanently. The eleth the Valkynes release is collected both ambiently after it's released, and it is thus used to recycle it, and is also sent to the Valkynes as such energy is released from the core of the world, which is one giant eleth reactor. So give it enough time, and the Valkynes will build up enough of a charge to release more eleth. It's just the three Valkynes process the raw eleth energy from the core into a form that maintains the world's life support system, and the crystals the populace in turn rely upon. The bigger problem with him doing this is for entities like Lambda. Oh my, is that a massive power boost.
いる限り安息の時が訪れることはない。いずれ決着をつけてやる。覚悟しておけ。
待って。
ソフィー、どうした？
ダメ。リチャードは友達。ダメ。みんな悲しむもの。
But this is the tip-off, as if there weren't already signs enough for the lot to pick up on, to something more being wrong with Richard than an undiagnosed case of bipolar schizophrenia. As even the most experienced of their number are baffled how someone could just drain the Valkynes dry, as the amount of power normally in them is far beyond something any human could normally even pretend to stand. The group return to Dylan, and find that Hubert has already arrived. There's a timeline problem with that like crazy. Yeah, Athenia is a terraformed moon, so their world isn't huge, but it still takes a couple days to reverse what they have, and the ruins they were in are right next door. So for Hubert to be there now, it would mean he left his post before Dylan and Garrett had their confrontation earlier, while Hubert's position was still up in the air. But there's a reason for that, as the water Valkynes wasn't the only one drained dry. Lambda took out the one in Barona before he left, so that's now 2 Valkynes that are no longer releasing eleth. And that means that Lant, thanks to Strahta mining their supply of eleth dry already with none to now be released by the drain generator in Barona, is now politically, economically, and militarily worthless. So there is zero reason for Hubert or any Strahtan occupation force to be there any longer, especially after Windor's army had itself withdrawn back to the capital. Meaning that the first moment that something becomes useless to him, Hubert abandoned it to fend for itself. like father, like son. Well, okay, I exaggerate with that. Hubert did need to update Dylan of the situation so actions could be taken accordingly. And as the genuinely most understanding, competent, and responsible of the senior leadership we see in this fucking game, Dylan immediately ascertains that this is a bigger threat that affects the well-being of all nations. And putting a stop to whoever is causing it should be the highest priority, regardless of whether that is Richard himself or some malicious force acting through him, which he charges Asbel and his team to find a way to stop as those who have dealt with them in the past.
君は陛下のことをよく知っているし、お仲間はバルキネスクリアスに詳しい。適任だと思うんだが。
Seriously, best damn faction leader in this game. No offense meant to what we see of non-possessed Richard later on, as his only shortcoming is not dealing with the political machinations of his nobility. As hell, laying some trust into good-intentioned adventurers has shown to pay him and those he is responsible for dividends by delegating the actions that create the solutions that resolve his crises to people with the apparent knowledge to properly resolve them. A good leader doesn't just make the decisions unilaterally over what they think is right. They listen to those who specialize in the fields they themselves are not the masters of to more properly make informed decisions about those matters to determine a proper solution, and not just as a stopgap. That's actually why the detail of Pascal producing and Asbel diplomatically presenting a diagram of the way to fix the Valkynes was actually an important one, as it shows he takes those things seriously and isn't just randomly trusting a con artist selling snake oil, as a functioning Valkynes has more value to it than inserting eminent domain over another country's territory, as that's a losing gamble in the long run, as long as you're not forced into sheer desperation. The one downside to this, then, is that he assigns Hubert to work with us. Probably because he can trust Hubert after the good impression Asbel made to look out for Strahta's interests in this, and he tells Hubert to assign his own replacement to look over the Lant territory in his absence. Which he likely already did since, again, it's several days' travel from Lant to the Strahtan capital by ship. And for Hubert to travel with his brother until this can be resolved, which will likely require travel through our next region of interest, Fendel.
そういう甘い考え方は嫌いです。だから、あなた方と行くのは不安なんですよ。
How can such a whiny bitch still be such a bastard? It's characters like him that make me not enjoy this game. As for Richard, however...
まだ足りないのか。力が必要なのか。君と僕の理想のために。君は何者なんだ。このままだと僕はアスベルやソフィーを違う。彼らは僕を裏切ってなんかいない。友達なんだ。友達。
Now, I played as much of that scene as I did, as it helps define, for those who didn't catch on to Richard being possessed yet, of how powerful and intrusive the thoughts of Lambda have become, and instead of deceiving Richard into a self-destructive course of action, is actually hijacking his body. And the more he's absorbed, the more control he actually has. So Richard can less and less resist, with only those small moments of protest, what he can do as he's more and more subsumed into the being possessing him. It exonerates him personally of the more malicious actions we've seen, which in some ways is a mistake. For Lambda keeps having to deliberately go out of its way to cause situations where Richard is at odds with everyone to reinforce its own beliefs onto Richard, instead of the situation developing naturally to justify that position. Which inevitably makes Lambda's argument about people and bonds, that others will always betray you so it's better to only care for yourself, less valid. And again, there was an easy way around this, by making Hubert the host instead of Richard. Nothing done, once again in this game, makes that a difficult role swap. The most that would be a problem could have been Lambda getting close enough to drain the Windor Valkynes of Eleth, but one could argue him getting close through a request for negotiations. Hell, it would have actually filled a bit of a... I don't want to say a plot hole, as there's ways already to validate it in story, but a question that never gets answered of why the Strahtan Valkynes just stopped releasing Eleth. Now, yeah, Pascal says it just started to break down as the device had not been maintained, and that is a valid in-story explanation. But what could have worked equally as well is Lambda slowly draining the Eleth from its environment to power itself, which is implied to have happened in the story with Richard being hosted by it. It makes little sense for all the Eleth in the kingdom to suddenly be depleted from literally only one battle to retake the throne, considering Windor is a large kingdom that, while is reliant as the others on Eleth, is not as excessive a user of it like the other two countries. So the question can be raised, where did it all go? And then you come to the fridge logic realization after we see Lambda Richard drain the Valkynes dry, that Lambda ate all of it to power itself, and that's part of why it was becoming so much more active to take complete control of the young king. So in a version of the story where Hubert was Lambda's host, you have just as valid a reason for why Strahta's water Eleth would have started to be more rapidly depleted that could then be more hidden between the excessive waste by Strahta's high society and a Valkynes that's not been maintained. Think there's one problem to it all, but instead it's one problem disguising another that is an underlying root cause. For you can't fix a problem properly unless you determine what the actual instigators of it are. And that one thing masquerading as another element once more ties into why I feel Hubert would have been the better host, as every invasive thought of Lambda's that makes Richard suddenly different would have all been natural with Hubert due to his own isolation and abandonment. So instead of one voice battling the other, it becomes a careless whisper reinforcing what one already mistakenly believed. It becomes representative of generational trauma instead of an exorcism story. But of course, we can't have that, because that would require, once more, holding Austin at fault, which the game never does. Before we can finally go to Fendel, though, there's a host of side quests that open up that eats our time for the next few hours, including but not limited to a woman who believes Sophie is her dead daughter, who we need to find the trinket of to allow her to move on, which in turn teaches Sophie about what it means to be family. Hubert investigating the nature of his, Asbel, and Cheria's powers granted to them from Sophie that goes nowhere at this time. Returning to Lance, so Sophie can plant a bunch of seeds we've collected along our journey. Cheria's grandfather Frederick having a senior moment in misplacing a memento of Austin's. That is all just an excuse to trick Asbel and Cheria to have a couples moment, as where he left it is having a couples discount on paired items, which thus spawns the purportedly expected tsundere trope mannerisms in Cheria's actions around the entire proceeding. And again, if they hadn't screwed up Cheria's characterization and how toxic her treatment of Asbel has been, scenes like this of Cheria being insecure might have functioned as intended to the archetype, but it's too little too late for that due to the character's prior narrative-driven selfishness that she has never apologized for. Again, the apology on her behalf and a commitment to not repeat the problem actions course corrects anything else seen beforehand to let the tsundere act become natural. Yes, and it never works out how the writer wanted it to. Hubert having to be civil with his mother to find information on obtaining an international trade permit, once more reinforcing my point about how Aston screwed everything up, as those related to Lant had all been rescinded. That was one of the many precursors to the conflict depicted around Lant in this game. And it is actually the resolution to this quest that reveals how deeply Aston fucked up Lant by defying Cedric's attempt to rope him into the treason plot, and then never telling the king his brother was a traitor. And again, his silence is purportedly heroism by the witness to all this that tells them of the encounter when, oh shit, Aston had a witness to this argument to back up his claims against Cedric to the king to warn him of this plot, and yet he still did nothing! And more importantly, this scene reveals that Cedric's co-conspirator was always Garrett even this far back, meaning Aston knew he was selling his second son to a traitor, and yet still went through with it. You can't even argue, well, Hubert would do the right thing and turn him in, as he didn't. And Hubert was so traumatized from being abandoned, he was willingly letting himself be used! Traveling back to talk to Duke Dalen in Windor of odd things happening at the wall bridge, which turns out to be a random monster playing with a control panel in the Windor ruins. The beginning of the Fiery Joe family quest. Fiery Joe and his siblings are a bunch of morons who end up assembling one of the best gear shops in the game, if you put their family back together. Unfortunately, all three members are scattered everywhere, and it's a pain to track them down as it requires hunting through several inns in succession to gather them back together, and then finding them out in the world before they're finally done setting up shop. Tracking them all down now, in all places they spawn it at Windor and Strahta, however, will make it so they will then spawn everywhere else you go along your journey, so you can just flag the rest of them while you're there. Up in the North Woods, we find Bryce, the guy who attempted to assassinate Richard in the childhood arc, up here as a crazed nomad, as his part in Cedric's scheme ended up with him disappearing. One wonders why he wasn't just locked up for life or executed for attempted murder and regicide, but then again, I've not exactly been impressed by the leadership of Windor in this game, where Cedric doesn't even try to kill his loose ends. Him going MIA makes sense, as being able to question him would have, once more, tipped off the king to the plot against him, but him still being alive, less so. He attacks and he loses. After all, he lost to one of this group 7 years ago. I doubt he could take 6 of us, but afterwards he's just shown to be pathetic, a decrepit shell of a man that still needs to be brought in for his attempted murder and his part in Cedric's earlier plots. That they don't is another point against the game, as a game that is purportedly about making characters act responsibly continues to be entirely contradictory in how it applies that theme. Back in Strahta, Hubert asks for a rematch now that he's no longer Sophie Nanite powered, and loses in a few blows, admitting after the battle,
僕に負けるようであれば、大統領命令を無視してでも、この砂漠に置いていこうとも思いましたが。
Again, why is he not the actual antagonist? Though maybe this exchange was what was needed, as if you go back to Strahta after reaching the port, you'll find Daddy Asbel about to lead an insurrection against President Dylan, with intent to break Strahta into civil war that would deplete all their resources and cause needless death. Just confronting his pathetically incompetent guards is enough to scatter them. But then Hubert makes the same mistake Aston did, not turning this traitor over, as is his duty, to those he has sworn his loyalty. And finally, with all that done, we're finally off to Fendel, with the only way to get there at this point in the game being the Yu Liberte port, which will take us to a neutral midpoint called Warrior's Roost. And on the journey over, Pascal tries to break the ice over Hubert's poor attitude.
あと、好きな食べ物はバナナ、好きな色は黄色。他にも知りたいことある？
Someone tell Shiro.
あの人は何者なんですか？行動といい言動といい、怪しすぎる。確かに不思議な人だけど、パスカルがいなければ、俺たちはここまで来られなかった。これまでのことを否定はしません。だからといって、盲信するのは危険じゃないかと言いたいんです。
You're right, Hubert. We shouldn't put our blind trust in someone that could be out for themselves. So, get off the boat. What? I trust her more than him. At the Warriors' Roost, we see the next part of the plot be picked up. The Fendel soldiers having brand new technology which piques Pascal's interest, and ends up getting us into a bit of trouble because, well, this is jumping ahead a bit, but these weapons are a Martian technology. In fact, it is a Martian technology based off of ones Pascal herself designed, and she did not give out those blueprints. Her trying to get an answer to this unsettles the soldiers, leading to us to have to challenge the Riot's peak event at the Warriors' Roost. So, Tournament Arc.
必ず生き残る覚悟を決めろ派手に踊れアンスタンパルス
他に敵はいないみたい。
And I am vastly overleveled by this point. The Fendel soldiers tried to go back on their side of the bargain, drawing a weapon after the battle has been decided, leading to the ire of the Riot Peak Guardian, who is none of the game's super bosses. Yeah, I just go and challenge them right here. It's not like they're a recruitable party member. From doing so, we actually get another quest, as the Peak's Guardian is actually seeking a special sword. But due to his duties here, he can't seek it beyond the chance it finds itself in the hands of a challenger. But from it, we actually get Asbel's best overall weapon, the Leviatine, which I then keep equipped on him for basically the rest of the game, as it's better than his Master Sword and any weapon you get in the post-game new content that Tales of Grace's F includes. And it's here where we're going to call it for this vid, as we finally reach Fendel and see in the main story how much Austin's blockade truly screwed this country up. Oh, and for the curious, the aunt is so indifferent, she didn't even appear in the episode, or the story of the game. This review series was originally meant to be 6 parts, but the scripts end up taking up more time than that to relate the story and my critiques of it, so it needed a spare family member to fit the naming scheme I was going for with this one. I guess with this episode so focused on Strahta's issues, you could presume that Hubert's adopted dad had a sister that's indifferent to her brother's own machinations, as Hubert has a cousin that was in on the scheme to claim power, but the game doesn't exactly detail the Oswald family's lineage to say that definitively. So really, I needed a placeholder, and that was the last one available.